Who is going to fill in the rest of the story.
And Threadwell hired me to come in and design tools, jigs, and fixtures for the manufacture of their product.
What were some of the different jobs that you had there? I know you said that you worked at
well, I started as a tool designer and worked into product design, machine design. I did all the research and development at one period of time. And after quite a number of years, I was, I'll say, factory superintendent for one of the divisions. 1944, of course, was tail end, or not quite the end of World War II. It was still a fair amount of it to go yet. But Threadwell at that time was very, very instrumental in helping the war effort. Part of it for overseas, because Threadwell was the only company that had the cams and so forth for grinding the threads for British Association and British Standard Whitworth taps, and the hobs that made the dies. And after Sheffield was bombed in England, Threadwell became the sole source for their cutting tools. Perhaps a note of explanation as to the thread form might be in order here. The British Standard Whitworth and British Association threads being the normal 60-degree form, or the regular thread form, but I'll say what was standard in the United States and with the metric series was with a flat crest. But the British Association and British Standard Whitworth both had rounded crests and rounded roots at the thread, so that the form, instead of being just a V form with a flat top and a flat bottom, the form went through with a nice, gentle curve. The British thought this was the way to make threads, and so that we could be interchangeable, so that their parts could be interchangeable with other thread parts that had been previously made before World War II. They had to go with this, and Threadwell had Excel thread grinding machines, and we had the only set of cams, apparently, that were available at the time for making the British threads. So consequently, Threadwell became a prime supplier. After Sheffield was out, it was the prime supplier of British Standard threads. The product then that really opened up Threadwell and made it a force to be reckoned with in the cutting tool business. They had previously taken on the job of making rifling cutters and rifling cutter heads for Springfield Armory. This was another war effort. And Threadwell, too, did receive a couple of E awards. So they were recognized as being prime producers. Threadwell at the time was employing, I believe, somewhere between 300 and 350 people, running around the clock, and like most other places that were involved in war production at the time.
Did Threadwell continue to make the threads in that way after the war?
No, there was no call for it. In fact, even by the tail end of the war, the call had dropped off tremendously. And they went back to making regular standard United States thread, U.S. standards, SAE standards, which later became the Unified Thread Series. And this is now adopted across the world.
You had a shortage of materials during the war?
Yeah, the standard high-speed steels at the time were called T1 and M1. M1 was a reasonably new item on the market that had not seen much service as far as cutting tools are concerned. T1 was pretty much the standard across the industry, which was a tungsten-type high-speed steel. Required a certain type of heat treatment and so forth. But the tungsten, the fact that the tungsten had to come from overseas, really tightened up on the supplies of the steels. Threadwell, not being one of the larger users, was having a more than usual difficult time getting steel, so they started playing ahead with the idea of using M1, or a molybdenum type steel. There were some advantages to the M1 steel over the T1 and some disadvantages. The advantages were that you could work at a higher temperature. In other words, you didn't have to use as stringent a coolant, for example, when you were using the tool. You wouldn't have to use, I'll say, as costly a coolant. You could run at higher speeds. Ultimately, most of the companies went to M1. Disadvantages was that you didn't know the steel companies, number one, were not that good at maintaining a consistent product to us, so that you never knew exactly what you were going to get in the early days. Again, in retrospect, a little bit back during World War II, saw quite a few ladies come into the various plants and performing all kinds of operations. This was almost a male domain up to that point in time.
How were the women treated by other workers?
Well, probably with some degree of reluctance, if not to say the least, but there was a reluctance to tell them what they should know in some cases. But in other cases, they were welcomed because, hey, there was another pair of hands, that's all, another pair of eyes to do things that otherwise wouldn't get done. Some of them become very, very skilled at what they were doing. Made darn good inspectors, I know.
Did a lot of them stay after the war?
Yeah, quite a few stayed after the war. Many of them were lost about the time of the layoffs and so forth after World War II stopped. And some of them just never returned to in any industry. But many of them did. And it was, by now, this was a change of attitude, I think. The men in the plant got used to seeing women in the plant, women on almost every operation that we had. But so there was a degree of acceptance that was slowly coming, but it was there. They had to recognize that not only were the women good at what they were doing, but they were good for a lot of things that nobody had considered using them for, just heretofore.
Like what?
Jobs in supervision, for example.
Our guest today is Bernice Weld, who's going to tell you about some of the exciting and not so exciting and worrisome things that happened to her in what's called a home front here at home. Tell me what it's like to be here in town with a war on.
Well, I wanted to start in to get you onto the home front. We didn't actually go out and fight, and we weren't in danger of being killed, except there was a potential that Germany could come over here and bomb the United States. And so we had air raid wardens, we had air raid tests, and this is what I wanted to get into some.
Your life as you were an air raid warden.
I was an air raid warden.
And this is where?
I was in Berniston.
Okay.
But
well, tell us about being an air raid warden.
Well, of course, the picture of an air raid warden you see is a one in the cities that was walking the streets with a hard hat on, and but everybody had to black out their windows. We had shades that were dark colored and heavy, or you had some heavy dark material cover up your window so there was no light. Only emergency vehicles traveled with shaded lights, and everybody else was supposed to be off the streets. There were sirens on buildings and on poles and at strategic places, but I lived in North Berniston. Now that's a small town, and they had an air raid siren, but of course it didn't reach to the outskirts, and it wasn't feasible to put in sirens all over the country. So we did it by phone. So I was alerted by phone, and I had to run a few hundred yards down the road to alert one of my neighbors who has no phone. People didn't have phones sometimes. Also, we had another neighbor that had to go travel with their car up to on the hills to notify somebody else who didn't have a phone. And when she was up there, she could see a light.
Down in town?
Down in town. But you couldn't place it. And it took,
somebody is not living up to this air raid. Somebody is...
Imagine, just one light you could see. Yeah. Well, a month went by, and they finally located that light. It was in my attic.
It was on all this time?
All this time. Yeah.
And here's the air raid warden flouting her own rules. Oh, my.
So, well, anyways, I didn't live that one down too well.
Oh, but yeah.
And did you know that Raytheon had a plant in Greenfield?
What?
Yes. Raytheon?
I'm running a museum of our industrial heritage, and I've got a big display of all the firms in Greenfield engaged in World War II. And they got a Raytheon plane I never heard of.
Yes.
You got to tell me about that. Oh, boy.
Yeah, well, that was located at the corner of Kenwood and Federal Street, near Luntz Silversmith. I can't think of the name of the building.
Well, at one time, since my father's store later on was across the street from there, I know. Yeah. One time it was T. Morey and Son.
Yeah, that's the building. That's the building. It was empty. It had been empty, and they moved to Greenfield, and they just hired workers. They hired inspectors. They hired electricians, and trained. We were trained, and everybody went to work.
So you went in for a job? You got a job being
yeah, most everybody got a job.
Okay. I believe there's one requirement probably in a place like that. You still had to be alive.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what did you do?
They worked in teams of 2 or 3. You'd do it was welding pieces onto the bottom of the tube, and of course it was electrical, and they'd do a part of it, they'd go on to the next person, do a part of it, and the third person would do the rest of it, and then it was inspected. They were not finished there. You had to work fast because everybody had to be ready for the next person, for the next step, so you had to keep up with your work. And I was a supervisor, so I didn't get into the work part, but I was seeing that it went right.
So how many people did you supervise?
We've supervised 6 teams each. 6 teams of 3. 6 teams.
How many people were working there?
60, about 60 or so.
60?
Yeah.
And I never even heard of it. For gosh sakes, I've lived here all my life.
Now, these were very small tubes, no more than 1 inch high. And
you assembled little parts about 1 inch high and welded connections on the bottom and
that's
so on.
Right. and
Welded or soldered?
welded.
Welded. Oh.
Welded. Then, but they weren't finished here. The caps, the glass caps weren't put onto them. They were sent back down to the main plant.
Well, they'd probably put the glass cap on, put a vacuum in it.
Vacuum, yeah, vacuum. Then, but we did not know what we were making. We were never told. We couldn't find out what we were making.
You knew at least there was a radio tube, or did you even know that much?
Well, it was too small for a radio tube.
Oh.
It was very small. It wouldn't compare to a radio tube. So,
radio tubes back then were about so long and so on.
But after the war, they pulled out. They were only here after the war, and that was after Hiroshima. We found out that we had been making tubes for the atomic bomb. That's what we were making.
Well, I will be darned. I would never thought about a tube in an atomic bomb, but they were surely electrical, and there surely weren't any diodes and all those transistors and integrated circuits, so obviously they would have had to have tubes somewhere.
Yeah.
Surely. I'll be darned. The person that we're interviewing today is a person I've known since I was about so old, Jane Adamiorka.
As our generation came along, we were expected to go to college or go to work. I got bored, and I went up and applied for a job at GTD. And I was offered a job in the standards department, which was new to me, and I thought, well, that'll be great, so I went. And I started in October. And of course, along came Pearl Harbor.
Tell me your reaction when you heard the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. What did you think?
I was listening to the radio, and I couldn't wait to get to tell my father and tell my mother, and I'm running around yelling it because I just could not believe it. Since then, I've been to Pearl Harbor and seen where they bombed. And all these movies about it really bring back, it was a horrifying experience.
Surely was. All right, so after...
Well, after I worked at GTD, and I liked, it was in plant number 2, and I liked working it.
But standards department, what did you do?
Well, we set the standards for prices and the jobs the men were doing in the plant, making taps and dies. And I think probably the thing that impressed me the most was Mr. Harriman, who was the head of it, and Mr. Burt, and asked me why didn't I go over to the Greenfield High School, to the vocational school at night, and learn how to operate these machines so that I would know what the men were doing. So I went over a few nights to the vocational school and got a certificate to know how drill presses and lathes work. Then my immediate boss was a lieutenant in the Naval Reserve. He got called up. And so they asked me if I would like to be in charge of piecework payroll for plant number 2. All right, I said yes, of course. I was going to get the magnificent sum of 65 cents an hour, and they informed me that was 95% of what the job would pay a woman. And thinking that a year and a half...
Wait a minute, 95% of what they pay a woman?
No, 95% of what they would pay a woman. They were very distinct. Certainly my boss, who was a college graduate, was not getting 95 cents an hour. But I said, okay, I'll try the job, and I liked it. But I worked 9 hours a day, 7 days a week. Sometimes it was a split shift because you were in charge of the piecework payroll and you had to be sure that it was accurate and right. And I liked it.
By the way, on standards, this is sort of an analysis of how long it takes them to do a job.
They put the prices on jobs.
And I always wondered if I knew that you were looking at me, if I wouldn't slow down so I could...
Oh, they would. Exactly. That was the principle for why they wanted me to go to vocational school, so that I would understand the steps of operating a drill press or a lathe, and that then the men couldn't slow down because I would know.
Oh.
But they put the price to jobs, and I made out fairly well. I liked it. But that 95 cents 95% of what the job would pay a woman really rankled.
Oh.
The Marine Corps opened up in February of 1943. And by this time I thought, I don't want to be here the rest of my life. I'm 20 years old. I got bigger ambitions. So my father and I got aboard the train and we went to Boston. And I enlisted in the Marine Corps. And Aubrey Great met us down at the railroad station. He presented us with flowers.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
he was head of the draft board or something like that.
He was the recruiter in the Franklin County area for the Marine Corps. And we took off and we went down to Hunter College, which is in the Bronx. And I was in the 2nd Regiment of Marine Corps women. And there were 500 in each regiment. We had a 3.5-week boot camp. Believe me, that's not very long.
3.5 weeks.
3.5 weeks,
Yep.
so late. Then I got to go to Aviation Machinist Mate School in Memphis, Tennessee for 26 weeks. 26 weeks.
Aviation machinist mate, which meant you were working on aircraft
On
engines.
aircraft, yes. Mostly on the engines. And so this was a good experience. And after I finished that, I got to come home and leave. That was the only time I ever came home. That was in October. I reported back to Cherry Point, North Carolina, and then I was in for shock. The first time I'd ever been on a Marine base. Mm-hmm. Everything had been Navy before this, because Memphis, Tennessee was Navy. Down at Cherry Point, I ended up in A&R, which was assembly and repair. And of course, they said, oh, you can type, you can operate a comptometer, you've got to be in the office. Oh no, I didn't go to school for 6 months to be in an office. So I got to go out to El Toro, California, and Santa Ana. And I reported in there, and I went to work in engine overhaul for MAG 11. And that was a fun thing. There were only 3 girls in my shop, and there were only 13 of us in our class at Memphis, Tennessee.
There were 3 girls in the shop, but how many men?
Probably 25 or 30. Mm-hmm. And the one thing I will say, there was no margin of error for a woman. You did by the book, and you worked longer and harder. That's the one thing that they never expected anything to be easy. Mm-hmm. I liked working in engine overhaul, and then I got to go to our 2800 school run by Pratt & Whitney, and that's the engine that was in the F-4U Corsair airplanes.
Mm-hmm. That was the dive bomber, right?
Fighter.
Fighter.
Yeah, fighter.
Forgive me.
Yep. I did catch a dive bomber on fire once, because you would replace the engine, and then after the engine was all replaced, it had to go over on a flight line and be run for 1 hour and then drained out and be sure that everything was all right. So it was my turn to go over on the flight line, and I had a TBM, which is a torpedo bomber made by Barton, and I caught it on fire. And that was probably the scariest moment I ever had. The other things that in engine overhaul that was interesting is, because women had smaller hands, on F-4U engines, the carburetor was way up inside, and you could get your hands up inside with a wrench and get the nuts off. So they would be thrilled to pieces to let you get the carburetor off. Of course, all the oil came down over your head, and then they'd let you go up and you could have a shampoo and have an hour off. Mm-hmm. You know, AMM school, you had to learn to take apart a machine gun as well as work on airplanes. I saved all my courses, all this stuff in a book home, and I put everything together in hopes that someday some of my children will look over it. Probably my middle grandson, who's a history major, will, because he can understand some of it.
Mm-hmm. That will really be of interest to him and to everybody else, too.
Well, I'm appalled at the fact that there is no patriotism to speak of in the younger people. Mm-hmm. They don't get pounding hearts when somebody plays Star Spangled Banner and the flag goes by. They don't feel that we are proud to be an American.
That is surely, I think, one of the biggest differences between our generations and those that have come since. We knew the country was great before the war. We surely knew it during the war. It's lived with us all the time, and I'm proud of it myself.